So we're in this essay.
What page?
Tzadik Gimel Aleph.
Okay, I'm with you.
Yofi. So what did we see last time? We saw that during the exile, and the time of Achashverosh was the first time that this happened, the time of the Megillah, Zah is asleep. And what it means is Zah is asleep, that things happen not because of your emotional state. They don't depend on that. They become objective, as it were. They become related to reality alone. So they become reproducible. Right? And we talked about this, like the difference between empirical science and the ancient science. One way of thinking of it. But the effect that you have in the world is always the same. It doesn't depend on your emotional state. Hinei yadua. So he said, "Sheben ma'atzil nivraim." The second in your thing, it's the same paragraph, right? Hinei yadua, somewhere. שבין מעציל הנבראים צריך להיות ממוצע. Between the creator and the creation, there must be some kind of intermediate. What's the intermediate? Emesar sfirot ha'atzilut. That's the great novelty of Kabbalah, that you suddenly have these intermediates which are not personas or anything like that, but rather they are what we call the sfirot. What does this mean? That the Sfirot are a way of God revealing Himself in a limited fashion. He doesn't reveal all of Himself, because if He would reveal all of Himself, there would be no finite reality. There would only be God. And the whole point was to create something, as it were, independent of God, independent in the sense that it would have free will. So you make something in between. And the intermediate here is called the 10 Sfirot. שהם ממוצעים בין בחינת מעציל אין סוף ורוחו לבחינת נבראים ביה גן עדן העליון. And so they are what we call the higher Garden of Eden. These 10 Sfirot. The 10 Sfirot in the world of Atzilus. והתגלות מידותיו יתברך בבחינת אצילות דיו וגרמו אחד לא הוצרך אלא לצורך נבראים. And the whole idea that Hashem reveals these Sfirot, and specifically the measured ones. What are the measured ones? The measured ones are the ones that have to do with the emotional traits, from loving kindness down to foundation. They're called midot, they're called measured, because they're more limited. And as we said, they're emotional, meaning they translate as emotions. Loving kindness is love, and gvura is might, and so on. And one takes one's own self in order to understand God, meaning we personify to a certain extent. And what do we see? That when we are by ourselves, we don't need to reveal to anyone, because there's nobody else there, our traits, be it our intellect, be it our emotions. There's nobody to reveal it to. The only time you need to reveal these things, to put them out, to show them, to express them, expression would be the better word than revelation, is when there's somebody else, when there's an other. And we know that the Chokhmah, the wisdom of Atzilus, is the beginning of the expression, of the revelation. And through that sphira, wisdom, God reveals Himself in all the worlds from above to below. As it says in Mishlei, Hashem b'chokhmah yasad haaretz. God with wisdom founded the earth. Umevuar b'mkom acher lama dafka chokhmah. And in the Tanya, the Maggid explained this, why chokhmah is the source through which all of God's revelation comes into reality. V'chokhmah ila da'atzilut b'chinat memutza. והיא כלולה מבחינת המעציל אין סוף ברוך הוא, שהוא בחינת כלי לאור אין סוף ברוך הוא, ויש בה גם כן בחינת נברא ונקראת חוכמת התא. So the wisdom of Atzilus, the higher wisdom, is the intermediate here, and it contains two aspects. One aspect is that it's a vessel for the infinite, and the other one is that it appears to the creation what was created. And that's called, how it appears is called the lower wisdom. To say it another way, we would say that the infinite aspect of Chokhmah of Atzilus is the Torah. That's the higher aspect. That reveals the infinite. And we talked about this, that the Torah is infinite light contracted into finite space. And that was the trick of Hashem coming down on Mount Sinai. We talked about that. Why did it say Elokim? Because it was a contraction. Because Hashem took the infinite and he put it into something finite, so that every letter contains infinite light, infinite revelation of God. In other words, it means, for instance, that you could learn it from now until eternity, and every time that you learn it, there's something new that comes out, because there's infinite light in it, infinite revelation in it. That's the supernal part. That's the top half of Chokhmah in this case. What's the bottom half? The bottom side, which is for the creation, we would call science. We would say that the Chokhmah Tata, that's science. Another way of saying this. Science. The way that we study nature. The way we study nature, it's not infinite, but it reveals something. Like the Rambam starts his book, and he says, if you want to come to love and fear God, you have to study nature. So studying nature is a certain revelation of Hashem, but that's for the creation. It's through the creation itself. It's finite. It's not the same level.
Mashiach comes, we'll see God in nature. Then what does that mean?
I'll talk about this. It means that the finite will no longer conceal the infinite, meaning that even the lower part of reality will reveal the infinite in some way.
But a human being is finite, and it says that Kodesh Baruch Hu breathed in. Therefore, he put the infinite into the finite.
Put the soul. But now we're talking about not the soul. Soul, to learn the soul, to study the soul. The soul, not the psyche. To study the soul, you have to learn Torah. So that's the infinite. It's the same thing. What we're talking about here is that the physical nature of the world will reveal the infinite. And that's different than what we do today. I mean, it's a little bit more like what we do today.
The physical nature of the world reveals the infinite. You don't do that when you make a bracha?
But here again, you're going back to Torah. So you're, in a certain sense, yes, thanks to Torah you can do that. But for nature itself to speak, for nature itself to express the infinite without my bracha, that's a different level. And that's what you said, that when Mashiach comes, that's the big change that will happen. Eventually. It doesn't happen in the beginning, but eventually it happens. So how can it happen? So the idea is that matter is infinite. And we've found a lot of hints towards that in the last 100 years, that matter is infinite.
Perhaps that's why you can't go faster than the speed of light, because...
See, so that doesn't make any sense. You told me that yesterday from the BBC, which is just repeating what Einstein said. The Rebbe didn't agree, and I think that between...
He said that the speed of light has not been consistent. But did he say that what it is now cannot be changed? Maybe it can be slower.
For Einstein, the speed of light is true in all inertial frames of reference. It's always the same. It can never change. And it can't go up or down.
It's kadosh.
Okay. It's absolute. You don't say kadosh in science. You say it's absolute.
I said it as a joke.
Yeah. So. Amen. Another way to say chokhmah la chokhmah tata, this is another thing that appears in Chassidus, is bittul and shiflus. Bittul, to be null to Hashem, that's the higher wisdom. That's the top half of the wisdom. To be lowly, of lowly nature, to see my shortcomings, that is the bottom half of the wisdom. And so, in the future, being lowly will be a vehicle for infinite revelation. Right now it's not. When you're lowly, so it's only a preparation for ascending to bittul, ascending to nullification, and being able to be an emissary for the infinite. An emissary for the infinite means that I have a role to play in my life, and that role can be infinite, because I'm doing it for Hashem, and Hashem is infinite. In the future, it'll be that even between me and myself, my lowly nature is not part of my mission in life. It's more like it's like some kind of how to live a good life. It's not the purpose of life. It's not, the purpose of life is not to be lowly. It's a means to get to my mission. If a person is not lowly, they can't take on their mission at all. They can never acknowledge their mission. They'll never get there. They'll always be stuck taking care of their self-image and taking care of their ego and whatever. So you have to be lowly first of all. So in the future, being lowly itself will reveal the divine, which it doesn't do today. Today it's just a means. But in the same way that nature will reveal the infinite, so being lowly, being shafo, will reveal the infinite. In any case. לכל בחינת נבראים עליונים ותחתונים שבביאה שהוא בחינת דיבורו ורוח פיו ורוח אחרי כל העולמות. Anyway, ונקרא גם כן אימא תתה. It's also sometimes called, what's sometimes called? Who's called אימא תתה? The lower wisdom. The lower wisdom is sometimes called lower mother principle.
What's the lower wisdom?
We said here before that there's Chokhmah Ilah and Chokhmah Tata. So Chokhmah Tata is really Malchus. Here he does.
Is it part of Atzilus or no?
What?
So it's not in Atzilus.
Yeah, in Atzilus. Chokhmah Tata in Atzilus is really Malchus.
Well, Malchus is moving down to the next.
Eventually it moves down, and that's what he's going to say now. Sometimes it's called the supernal, the lower mother, the inferior mother, as it were. It's called Rachel, and it's called the mistress of the house, Akeret Habayit, Haminaheget et kol ha'olamot, and that's what you just said. That the Malchus comes down, then it runs, it provides for all the worlds that are below it. Moshe Katuv Atiten terf leveita. She gives sustenance, she gives spoils to her household. She gives them food. What does it mean? That the wisdom comes down. And that's called Memale Kol Almin. Like we always say, the Malchus is the light that fills all worlds. Ve'edua shenikret Knesset Yisrael, and it's also called the Congregation of Israel. Perush Klalut Nishmot Yisrael, the general source of all the souls of Israel. Biot ki hakelim shela pnimi emtzai chitzon. She has 3 vessels. Everything in Kabbalah. This is a pretty technical piece in the beginning, but we'll stop in a second. It has an inner aspect. The vessel has an inner aspect, a middle aspect, and an external aspect. Hapnimi shorish neshama shebebriya. The inner aspect of this vessel called the Congregation of Israel that contains all the souls of Israel is what we call the root of the soul in Bria, in creation. Ve'imtzai, in the middle aspect of the vessel of the Congregation of Israel, is the root of the Ruach, of the Spirit, in Yetzirah, in formation. And Chitzon, in the external aspect of the vessel of the Congregation of Israel, is the root of the psyche in action. V'chol echad miYisrael, and every Jew, afilu kal shebakalim, even the, how would you say, kal shebakalim?
The simplest of the simplest.
Yeah, the lightest of the light. יש בו ניצוץ מנפש לעשייה, מלובש בהערה ממלכות דאציות, מכלים החיצונים שלה, לכן בחינת דיבור וחוכמת תתה מלא כל המין תלוי במעשיהם של ישראל, כמו שכתוב בזוהר, עושה קרנחת בגינה עוד ישראל, והוא עניין גלות השכינה. What's the point? The point is that Jews affect reality. The soul affects reality. What he now explained was why the soul has effect and influence on reality. Because he said, where is the soul coming from? The soul is coming from what we call the inner aspect. It's a vessel for the infinite. So the infinite is acting from the inside out. It's not the same thing as taking a glass of water and mixing it with salt. Okay? It's not the same thing, because that's only an external change. Nothing has internally been changed. Any mixture, even when you do fusion or fission or whatever you do, you're only affecting the external aspect of reality, but you're not affecting the internal aspect of the reality. That's the big chap in Chassidus and in Kabbalah to explain the difference between a soul and a body. That the body in the end can only affect the external. And that's a very big point. It has to be understood. Really, how it's discussed in Kabbalah is usually around the question of saying a blessing over food. Because if you're gaining the sustenance from the physical body of the food, why do you need to say a blessing? Just eat it. You say the blessing according to Kabbalah because you're awakening, you're affecting the food internally. You're doing something to it on the inside. That's what the blessing is for. You can't do that by eating. Okay? It doesn't work. Because when you eat, it's just your physical nature meeting the food's physical nature. And that doesn't do anything to change the internal nature. To change the internal nature, you have to do something with the soul. And that's the big chidush that Kabbalah has over Nigle. Nigle doesn't explain why you need to do these things. And the Kabbalah says, the reason you're doing all these things is because the soul has an ability to affect the inner nature of things, and not just the external aspect, which is how you affect it with your body. Okay? And it's a huge sugya in Chassidus. This is one of the big ones. How is it that we're able, a lot of times when you read the Talmud and they say, this sage did that, and that sage did that, you shouldn't understand it literally. Because they didn't affect it physically, they affected it spiritually.
But I thought the idea of making a bracha was to elevate yourself, not to elevate the food.
No, the food. Why yourself?
Because you're making a bracha, you're acknowledging a Kodesh Baruch Hu.
Very good. For what?
For giving you the food.
Okay. So, why do you make a bracha before? That you could say is why you say the bracha after. Acknowledge, like every person says thank you for what they received.
But Gemara says it's a kal v'chomer if you have to say thank you afterwards. So you should say thank you before, because that's derech eretz.
Still, say. Anyway, that's how it's understood in Kabbalah. I have to think more about it. But
so you want to elevate the food?
You're elevating the food. You're changing it.
So what happens to this elevated food now?
You can take the sparks out.
And it comes out the other side.
Okay, that's the physical part of it that sustains the physical part of you. But the spiritual part, lo al alechem yivado yechia adam, the man does not live by the bread alone, ki al kol motza pi Hashem yechia adam, but rather by the word of Hashem, man lives. So what is the word of Hashem? The word of Hashem, they explain, is the bracha. And the bracha allows the spark. Okay. So that's the thinking behind blessings. Okay. In any case, let's continue. ואתה צריך להבין איך נתהווה בחינת דיבור להחיות העולמות מבחינת חוכמה עילה, הנ"ל שהוא הוויה בחינת סובב כל עלמין. So now, since everything is up to us, as a soul, we've been given this power to control the inner aspect of reality. The question is, how does this happen? How does it actually happen? What's the process? So now he's going to explain the process. Again, it's going to be a little bit more technical terms, but it'll be worth it. V'inyan. So how does it work? Explains in Eitz Chaim that the beginning of the feminine side of the small countenance of Zah starts from the chazeh, from the chest. Now this is a metaphor. What is it a metaphor for? What is it trying to tell us? So he says, every person understands that if all I want to do is be yotze, meaning I just want to fulfill the requirement, all I need to do is just say the blessing. Let's say I'm an actor, and all I do is I read my lines. That won't cut it. Why? Because I'm not having an effect on the audience. If I want to move your soul, I have to say it with passion. I have to say it with some inner meaning. I have to mean what I say. That's za. Za is my emotions. So the fact that the feminine begins from the chest is saying that the feminine here is like the speech. And speech starts from your chest. It starts from your emotions. That's what we call dvarim hayotzim min halev, nichnasim el halev upoalim pa'ulatam. The words that come out of the heart, they have an effect on someone else's heart, and they change them. They make an effect on them. But that's only if they come from the heart. Only if the nukva, the feminine, which is speech, if that comes from the heart. And it's true, that's where it starts. That's where nukva starts. So naturally, our speech should have an effect. Okay? That's the natural way that things work. How does this work? Ki za midot chesed ugvura, because za is the chest. It's the love and might, or love and fear. Ahava hu or likli chesed. Love is the emotion that's associated with chesed, with loving kindness. Ki chafetz chesed hu, because he wants love, or wants loving kindness. Umin hamoach yotzei hamshacha derech hagidim lalev shen hamidot. So the picture was that from the mind causes the feeling in the heart. That's true. If we're talking about natural feelings, that's not true. A person feels first and then he thinks about what he feels. But if you're talking about conscious feeling, that a person wants to feel a certain way, he knows that this is important for him. So for instance, he has to go for an interview. Or he's an actor. An actor is the same way. The actor first thinks about it, and then he feels it. And sometimes they have to cry. So they can make themselves cry. It's not so difficult. And you don't have to use onion. You can do it by suggesting it to yourself through your mind. That's the way that a conscious person feels. Again, there's also natural feeling, which is without being conscious of it, it just comes up. And that's feeling that starts in the heart. But here we're talking about, I want to affect reality. So I start in my mind, and it causes my emotions to quiver, to start moving. So it's called that the mind controls the heart, where the measures, where the emotions are. And the heart heats up the air in the lungs. And again, this is not a physical description, it's a quasi-physical description. Unfortunately, some people understand it physically, but that was never the intent. It's just saying, why are the lungs near the heart? What's the spiritual reason that God put the lungs near the heart? Why not put the heart, I don't know, up here? It would be easier to pump, maybe, because, I don't know, harder to pump. I don't know, maybe put it down in the stomach. It's pretty much down there, under these things. So the spiritual reason is because we understand that the heat in the heart heats up the air in the lungs. That's the quasi-physical description. What does that give you? It gives you that the air that comes out and becomes speech is laden, it's carrying the heat of the emotions. That's what allows the speech to be emotional. That's what allows you to express emotions. And if it wasn't that way, then we would have to find some other way of expressing our emotions. Okay? We'd have to find something else. And the way that this works is that in this way, speech carries the emotions of the heart, and all this is where it's all coming from the chokhmah tata. It's all coming from the lower wisdom, malchus, that's giving life to everything. Okay, so that's the technical side. Now he'll explain what does this mean in practice. Hine, כשהיו ישראל במעלה העליונה בזמן הבית, היו בחינת זון פנים בפנים. When the temple was standing erect in Jerusalem and we were at our highest state, our highest spiritual state, then the feminine, which is the speech, and the masculine, which is the emotions, were standing face to face. Meaning the heart and, call it the air coming out of the lungs, were in touch, but not just in touch. They were cooperating. They were together. They were looking one at another, as it were. They understood one another. Why do we call this face to face? Because we see that in the face, in the front side of the face, you have the eyes and the ears and the nose and the mouth, and you see emotions. You can see emotions in the front of the face, the front of the head. That's called face to face. When you feel emotions, when you're transferring emotions from one side to the other, from one person to the other, in this case from your heart to your speech. But the backside, which we talked about in terms of Amalek last week and the beginning of this week, there's no way to see emotions there. You can't see anything in the back. It's just hair or a hat or a kippah, whatever. There's nothing there. You can look at it and stare at it all you want. You want to understand if the person's angry or is happy, or there's nothing there. There's no windows into
no signs.
Okay? So therefore we say it's from the backside, there's very little life force coming out of here. There's nothing being expressed here. It's not that there's nothing at all, because somebody who's very attent can even see from the back some things, but it's very little. He says the same thing is true with our senses. Not just eyesight, we only see from the front and so on, and we're seen from the front, but even in terms of touch. He says that the face is the front, if you feel it, you see it's much more sensitive than the back. The back is far less sensitive. הנה, למידותיו יתברך אין שום השגה לשכל אנושי בהם, שאינם מכלל מהות וערך מידות אנושי, ואפילו מבחינת דיבור שלו, ואינו אלא לסבר את האוזן. So, all this is in man, and it's also the same in God. But, the caveat, this is as close as we can come. Right? The usual caveat. This is what we can understand. ומבשרי יחזה, כידוע המשל. If we continue to look at what happens. So, the mashal is, the well-known thing is, misrefat ha'etzim nasa efer. When you burn wood, you get ashes. Ken b'chinat Avraham u'avi. What does it mean to burn wood? Burning is a metaphor for being on fire. It's for feeling emotions. So when you speak with fire, when you speak with emotions, what are you left with in the end? You're left with ashes, because you burned something. What was burning? The heart was burning. The air in the lungs was burning. Whatever it is, you're left with ashes. That is Avraham Oavi. That's what we mean when we say Avram who loved me. What do we mean? That Avram did everything with passion. And when he says about himself, V'anochi afar va'efer, that I am nothing but dust and ashes, he's not saying just that he's lowly. That's not only that. He's saying everything I've done for Hashem, everything I do in my life, I only leave ashes when I'm done. Meaning I become ashes. I put my whole heart and soul into it. All my emotions go into every act that I do. We know people like that.
But ashes are not the same as the original thing that it was. It's something new.
No, it's the leftovers. When you burn wood, there's nothing new that came. It's just the leftover from the wood.
But it's not the same elements. Some of the elements of God.
Oh, it's carbon. Again, obviously, the air left, the oxygen left, and this left, and that left, and you're left with the leftovers. But that's what I did. When I do things with passion, it's called that I'm left as ashes in the end. That's the metaphor. And that's why Avram is called Avram who loves me. Why? Because everything he does with passion. He does with love. So he's the chariot of loving kindness, and he's called dust and ashes. And even the angel of loving kindness in the world of creation is relatively external. His love is relatively external relative to Avram's love.
Right, he complained to Hashem, I don't have any work to do.
All this is during the time of the temple. Either in the time of the patriarchs, Avram and Yaakov, as we'll see, Yitzchak is different, Avram and Yaakov, or in the time of the temple, that when people did things, they did it with passion. There was, I say it a different way, that if you wanted to affect anything, if you wanted to see an effect, in reality, you had to do it with passion. You had to do it with some kind of, and that, again, that's what I said about alchemy yesterday. That the alchemist is not the chemist. The difference being that the chemist,
So if I get excited about it, I can turn my...
you're lead into gold. By the way, it's a metaphor. They never meant to turn lead into gold. Only the idiots, only the idiots who didn't understand alchemy thought that you could actually turn lead into gold. What they meant was that you can turn call it the lackluster, the dead feelings, depression, into happiness, into joy. That's what they were really looking at. And it took a long time for people to understand this, but they understood this intuitively. If you read any of the ancient texts, you see right away that they're talking psychologically. But they knew something that we also know, that even when you're talking about something psychological, there has to be some kind of physical expression for the same process. It won't happen.
Everything which is Gashmis is a Ruchnis accountable.
So the Ruchnis needs some kind of Gashmis counterpart. We talked about this like with the Baal Shem Tov, that when he drank tea, he only held the sugar in his fingers.
Right.
Why do you need the sugar in the first place? If you're feeling the sweetness anyway in your mind,
because you need the
I don't know what to call it,
the
symbol. It's a symbol for it, and it works because of that. Okay, we'll continue tomorrow.
Tomorrow is
God willing.
Okay. It always happens when it's Yom Shlishi.
It's a very strange thing.
Right.
Have you noticed that?
That means we're running at 8:45. 8:45.